My name is Jacob. I'm coordinating digital initiatives at the National Museum of Denmark. I'm here with my colleague, a senior researcher at the National Museum, Martin Appelt, sits right here. And also, not exactly my colleague, but my collaborator, Pernille Felt. She's a research assistant at the Copenhagen University, and she sits down here. And the presentation is very much a result of our shared efforts. As you can see my slide with the agenda, I just wanted to tell you that first off, I wanted to share some stories around how we've been working very hard driving forward the concept and the practice of the open museum. Paving the way and addressing the challenges of the open museum, we've been very busy learning a lot of new things about copyright law, obviously, clearing the way for the open museum, as I said. We feel we've found a way to address the challenges and issues of the copyright law and the barriers that it holds to the opening up the museum to the internet and to the creativity of the internet. Having kind of addressed those challenges, we've seen time and a room for another kind of discussion on cultural rights. So not exactly legal rights, but other kinds of rights that we necessarily need to address in our work. 7% of the collection of the National Museum of Denmark is available via the museum's exhibitions. Like 93% is hidden behind locked doors, and only a very select few of the employees of the museum actually are able to access the rest of the entire collection. In terms of the archival material of the museum, almost nothing of the iceberg is above the sea line of accessibility, so to speak. That obviously is a huge problem. We're being an open institution in many ways, but in this sense, we're also a very secret museum, actually. So obviously digitizing the stuff, the knowledge, the information of the museum, transfer that material into a different kind of domain that opens up new ways of using the collections and information and knowledge of the museum. So we, as many other heritage institutions, absolutely loves cameras and scanners. They are the midwives of heritage content. They help bringing stuff to a new life that was previously only a mere potential somehow. So this is a graph of the growth of the digital collection of the National Museum in the past years, and it's continually growing. So this is the basis of us launching the first version of the museum's collection website in 2014. Many museums, archives, libraries are working on this kind of effort that is kind of mainstream as it is now. The website is pretty much just a suite of landing pages presenting the objects and the records of the museum that has been published so far. And that website obviously helps us rise the iceberg in keeping on that metaphor. To be honest, the website was initially pretty much a broadcast paradigm product in the sense that it was read-only. Museums, as many other kinds of institutions and organizations, have been working within the broadcast paradigm for many years, hundreds of years. Obviously, the internet has propelled kind of a shift in that, or supplied a new kind of model to the earlier broadcast model of things, illustrated by these kinds of illustrations of how we're not anymore just the authoritarian voice sharing our work with the world, but we're also part of different kinds of networks and collaborations in a different way than we were earlier on. So crowdsourcing has been mentioned a few times, the read-write web, and that's a thing we've been working on as well, doing crowdsourcing events. We've been busy arranging hackathons in Denmark as well for the past years. Since 2012, we had our first one, like a dedicated heritage hackathon. Obviously, what we want to achieve there is to allow for multiple voices, multiple actors in the sense of that we should not be the only ones like refining and realizing the potential of the collection of the museum, but everybody should basically be invited into the creative workspace of the museum. So that's a way for us to kind of blur the boundaries of our institution, inviting creative hackers and creative concept developers, journalists, writers, historians, people like that. Actually, in this upcoming weekend, beginning tomorrow, we will have our 6th Heritage Hackathon in Denmark, and you're more than welcome to follow us online, and we normally do live streaming of presentations and stuff like that. We've had to address a lot of issues on opening up the museum, obviously, because we would very much like to do that in a legal kind of way. To be honest, 5 years ago, the National Museum of Denmark, as were many other kinds of heritage institutions, we were basically pirates. We had a huge image collection, and we pretty much handled it like it was our own, and that we could do with it whatever we wanted to. We weren't asking right holders, we weren't paying right holders, we were making money off of our image collection. Fast forward 5 years and a very steep learning curve. Now we've kind of legalized our open initiatives in the sense that we have begun clearing rights directly with rights holders, inviting them to allow us to share the content that they were initially the creators of under Creative Commons CC by or CC by SA licensing. So in that sense, we have decriminalized a lot of already ongoing activities, but we've also opened up new spaces for new activities, as it is the case with crowdsourcing, as it is the case with hackathons. So we're not spending that much time cracking the nut of copyright anymore. We found a way to implement workflows and processes that help us keep open the road for the open museum and the sharing museum, the writable museum, the remixable museum. And that has opened up, that has given us a chance to spend time and energy on other kinds of issues that we feel is as pressing as the actual law or copyright law issues. And this has to do with cultural rights. So as you can sense, we very much feel like we've got a strong case of democratization going on. We're democratizing the museum as such, the collection of the museum, sharing it widely. Earlier on, though, for a museum to have a collection, we would be the owners of the collection in the legal sense of the word, but we would very much also be the owners of the knowledge and information around the collection. And also describing objects earlier on had to do with describing the objects on a very physical, kind of direct level. But obviously there's a lot more to the story of heritage collections than just describing how big it is and where it comes from and how much it weighs and stuff like that. There's a lot of practice that has to do with heritage, cultural practice. So we've kind of moved from being gatekeepers of both the collection and the information and knowledge around the collection and the narratives that we describe the collection with, to being gatekeepers of the physical collection, but have kind of blurred the boundaries of the information and knowledge around the collection. So as illustrated with the, crowdsourcing and hackathons as examples, we're using digital technology to allow for initiatives on kind of a sharing of the so to speak, the storytelling or the descriptions of the collection. Another thing is that, as also mentioned, that it's kind of wrong to separate the objects from the from the cultural meanings that they've been a part of. And defining the cultural meanings is not something that we exclusively are the ones that are supposed to be doing, but something that other people as well have a right to be a part of. One example that kind of highlights this issue is the collections. For example, Martin is a researcher within the ethnographic collection of the museum. Obviously, the stuff in the ethnographic collection stems from or originates from different kinds of communities abroad, indigenous and remote communities. So, who's the rightful owner of the objects? Who owns the digital representations? Who owns the contextualization of the collections? Contextualization meaning the descriptions, the information, the narratives that surrounds the collections. What we've sensed is that there is not a unanimous answer to those questions. Depends on if we're discussing the objects or the collections of the museum, and the situation is somehow different. The ownership is more diverse in the sense of the contexts of the collection. So as we see it, we have a new means to strengthen the work on cultural rights. We have tools for strengthening the stakeholders' cultural rights to the collection of the museum. One of the things that Pernille has spent a lot of time on is delving into cultural rights and a lot of the stuff that has been written around that. Farida Shahid did a report in 2011 where she created knowledge on what the UN member states actually thought of cultural rights and what kind of role they have. So the UN Declaration for Human Rights, Article 27, paragraph 1, very clearly states that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community. In the concrete case, participating in the cultural life of the community is also about being able to participate in the knowledge creation around the collections that we as a museum own, but that stakeholders, different kinds of stakeholders, has a right to be a part of, as it is stated here. Further, people also has the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. We've got roughly 200 scientists and researchers at the National Museum. Obviously, the work of them is something that is to be shared in a very open and free manner. I feel a little hard pressed on time, maybe also because of the technicalities early on, so excuse me for jumping through a little bit of the slides here. There is further quotes on the work by Farida Shahid and other documents stating interesting stuff about cultural rights. So digital technologies provides new ways for still more museums users to assert and identify their heritage. The object might be ours, but the meaning surrounding them are also other people's. Virtual representations of the museum objects allow for this to be done without compromising the physical safeguarding and preservation of the objects. That's why we have them. That's the thing that we are working very hard to maintain, is to safeguard and preserve the objects. But could museum practices then be seen as supporting the idea of the universal museum? In 2002, a handful of directors of the world's oldest and most well-known museums signed a declaration on the importance and value of universal museums. To make the story short, obviously the internet, digitization, digital media allows for an advancement of the concept of the universal museum. Digital museum practice extend the toolbox of the constant negotiation of cultural rights and heritage that is core to the practical work of museums. To end our talk here, that was a little bit shorter than maybe we hoped. We would like to highlight our project, and this is where very much the work of Martin comes in, that we're working on. In 1921 to 24, there was a Danish expedition that traveled through Arctic Canada called the Fifth Tool Expedition. So we were contacted a few years ago by the Kitikmeot Heritage Society that is located there. What they wanted to was to build a collaboration with us, with them in Arctic Canada, working on making the spectacular collections available to the descendants of the people that from the area where the collections were collected. Kitikmeot Heritage Society considered the project very important in their work towards a cultural revitalization of their community through the empowerment of the descendants of the area of the Fifth Tool Expedition. The vast amount of material collected during the Fifth Tool Expedition was acquired among very different people living in very different areas stretching across 3,000 kilometer wide area. So obviously there are a lot of different kinds of interests, a lot of different kinds of cultural practices, and a lot of different kinds of revitalization efforts going on throughout that entire area. So we have a strong sense that one way of working with this doesn't necessarily fit all in those areas. As previously mentioned, the overall policy of the National Museum of Denmark is to establish a free and easy access to the knowledge, information and collections of the National Museum. By now we already know that some of the source communities will have reservations on us just opening up the collections that has so much to do with their heritage and their social and cultural revitalization efforts today. And this is where cultural rights kind of come into play for us, is the fact that obviously on the with one hand we need to address copyright law and those opportunities and barriers that are in that domain. But on the other side, or with the other hand, we need to take serious the concept of cultural rights and have a balanced take on how to create a useful accessibility and projects. Our aim is definitely to strike the right balance between a fully open digital access to the Fifth Tool Expedition material, while at the same time accepting that the cultural rights of some communities means that part of the collection should either not be published or only published in a manner in which they cannot be decontextualized too much. We aim to create a space in which different knowledge traditions and insights at the museum and in the different communities can be used to create important and meaningful starting points for multiple dialogues with and between the widest possible public audience. The Fifth Tool Expedition project shows how digital archives and communication means pave the way for increased access to cultural heritage. Heritage that in a legal perspective is owned by the National Museum of Denmark, but with the source communities, but which the source communities identify as theirs. So we own it, but it is theirs. So that kind of duality is very much at the core of our discussion. Heritage that is important to them as a reflection and an expression of their constantly evolving values, beliefs, knowledge and traditions. In our view, digital means can help enforcing cultural rights, including the right to access and enjoy cultural heritage. But cultural rights can also restrict the use of digital, as demonstrated by the resistance exhibited by the source communities, when we as a museum want to apply open licensing to the Fifth Tool Expedition collection. So digital comes to pinpoint the intangible aspect of the material object and a notion of ownership. one perhaps more associated with the right to control the interpretation of the object than one of legal ownership. So to sum up, museums still hold the role of gatekeeper of the collections for the sake of preservation and safeguarding. At the same time, our museum is however acquiring a much less binary position where it can accommodate a wider range of considerations and solutions in negotiating cultural rights and ownership with our many stakeholders. A work that demands a balanced take on legal rights with one hand and cultural rights with the other hand. So thank you very much. I hope you benefited from this talk, and let's hear from the next one. Thank you.